In this video, we're going to be discussing how personality affects your health. First, you're going to take 4 questionnaires, tally your scores, and enter them on the following slide of your notes. Please use the questionnaires in your notes to take all 4 questionnaires, then enter your scores on this slide in your notes. Alternatively, you can pause the video and take the questionnaires without downloading the notes PowerPoint. Please pause the video now to take and score questionnaire 1. Please pause the video now to take and score part 1 of questionnaire 2. The second part of questionnaire 2 is continued on the next slide. Please pause the video now to take and score part 2 of questionnaire 2. Please pause the video now to take and score questionnaire 3. Please pause the video now to take and score questionnaire 4. If you haven't done so already, please pause the video and take a moment to jot down your scores for these 4 questionnaires. So, what kind of people get sick? Well, today we're going to focus on 3 main issues. You'll see that overall, health psychology as a field tries to determine whether there are psychological traits that make a person more likely to get sick. Before we move on to talking about a disease that does have a personality component, I just want to mention a few things. Keep in mind while you compare your personality scores to the data I'll be presenting in this video, that just because personalities are involved in health, it doesn't mean that you will get sick if you have that personality trait. It also doesn't mean that you caused your illness if you have that personality trait. And it doesn't mean that you deserved to get sick if you have a personality trait associated with a certain illness. Just remember that personality is just one of many factors that affect our health. One disease that has been linked to a personality component is heart disease. Heart disease is the leading killer of men and women in the Western world. Over half of all people over 45 who die in the United States die of some form of heart disease. There are several risk factors for heart disease, and you guys know about what these risk factors are. Smoking, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, etc. Another risk factor for heart disease is type A personality. People with type A personality have an exaggerated sense of urgency. They're always in a hurry to get things done and setting deadlines for themselves. They're also highly competitive and ambitious. Finally, they tend to be aggressive and hostile when things don't go their way. Before we talk more about type A personality, let's watch a short clip about the discovery of type A personality.
Type A was first described in the 1950s here in San Francisco. Cardiologists Meyer Friedman and Rosenman, and here was their original formulation. Time-pressured, hostile, impatient, low self-esteem, joyless striving. Okay, like 80% of us. And what these guys reported was, if this is what you're like, you are more at risk for heart disease. Cardiologists hated these guys. You're some 1950s Ozzie and Harriet cardiologist, and all you're thinking about is heart valves, and here's these guys instead saying, no, you got to sit down your patient and talk with Christ. Who wants to talk to their patients and say, okay, so you're in the supermarket and you've picked the line that's going the slowest, you go out of your mind. That has something to do with heart disease. Huge resistance in the field, and it took decades to become absolutely clear from all the meta-analyses. Type A is for real big time. If you have a type A profile, you are more at risk for You are more at risk than if you smoke, than if you have elevated cholesterol levels, than if you are overweight. In terms of heart disease, it's a huge risk factor. And one of the things that's emerged in this field in recent years is a recognition of one of the key components of the type A profile, something that is now referred to as toxic hostility. And this is this attributional style where anything that happens in the world around you is proof that they're out to get you, they're out to get you preferentially, and the only way to protect yourself is have the knives out 24/7. This is, you pick the wrong line in the supermarket, and you want to kill the son of a bitch, get behind the cash register, come on, I have a 1 o'clock appointment. No, don't ask her how she is today, come on. If this is what you're doing, instead of checking out the Elvis sightings in the National Enquirer, your blood pressure is going to go up. And if this is what you're doing every time somebody could have held the elevator door open for you but didn't, you are going to cumulatively damage this system. And in lots of ways, the central question in this field now is, insofar as you have this toxic hostility, what's worse for your heart, expressing the hostility or keeping it repressed inside? What's clear is expressing it is worse for everybody else's blood vessels there, but what is the cost of repressing strong physiological sort of emotions? Okay, so that's stress and heart disease. Actually, one might wonder, how is it that these guys ever figured out about type A personality? How did they discover this? And I got to hear this story some years ago from the horse's mouth himself. Meyer Friedman, in cardiology, first described it. Died a few years ago in his 90s and was seeing patients up until the end. And as he used to say, I'm still type A, but I'm a type A tortoise now. And here was the story he would tell about the discovery of type A personality. Okay, 1950s, he and his partner had this cardiology practice, San Francisco, everything was fine. There was this one weird problem they were having, which was they were spending a fortune having to reupholster the armchairs in the waiting room. What is this about? Who knows? It's just part of the overhead. Every month the upholsterer comes in, a chair or two to fix. 1 month, the upholsterer is on vacation, replacement upholsterer comes in, takes one look at the chairs and discovers type A personality. Says, what is wrong with your patients? Nobody wears out chairs this way. And this is what it looked like. What you see is the front 2 inches of the seat, the front 2 inches of the armrest are torn to shreds like beavers are in there, dwarf beavers all night going on there. What is this? This is what a type A individual looks like when they are not just figuratively, but literally clawing at the arms of their chair there. This is them squishing and moving around. This is what an individual with a type A profile looks like when they're sitting in their cardiologist's office waiting for getting a result. This is exactly what it looks like. Okay, so what's supposed to happen at that point if science is working correctly? Like Friedman should grab him, like, good God, man, what you've discovered, or like midnight conferences between upholsterers and cardiologists, or teams of idealistic young upholsterers sweeping across America and coming back with the news that no, you don't find chairs like these in podiatrists' offices. That's what should have happened. What actually happens, here's where Dr. Friedman starts looking all sheepish, and he says, I told my nurse, get this man out of my face. I'm this important doctor. He's wasting my time. Give him his damn check. He was too type A to listen to the guy. And it was years before he collaborated with a psychologist and out popped this profile. And he said, oh my God, the upholsterer was right. To this day, nobody knows who that guy was. Let's see, it's early afternoon. I am willing to bet there in some bar in the marina or something right now, there's some 95-year-old retired upholsterer who's just drinking away there, and you get him started, and he's going to go on and on about how he discovered type A personality. Absolutely true. So one of those dark moments in the history of science.
So how do we measure type A personality? Well, we know that type A's eat too fast, are generally considered very active or too active by others. They set all kinds of deadlines for themselves, and they get irritated by interruptions. And they always play to win, even in silly little games. So based on this, we can build items to ask people about the extent to which they engage in these behaviors. We can also interview people to bring out the type A personality in them, if they have it. For example, in a structured interview for type A personality, the interviewer purposely asks questions in ways that are designed to encourage type A behaviors, such as interrupting and talking fast and loudly. So the interviewer might interrupt the subject and ask for clarification in a harsh or maybe even rude way, perhaps by asking, "What do you mean by that?" instead of in a more neutral way, such as, "Could you tell me a bit more about that?" Also, the interviewers watch how the person acts at certain key moments in the interview. For example, the following question is asked exactly like this. Most people who work have to get up fairly early in the morning. In your particular case, what time do you ordinarily get up? Type A people usually jump in with their time by the second Type A people aren't at increased risk for illness in general, but studies do show that they are at increased risk for heart disease. One study that showed this link is called the Western Collaborative Group Study. This study followed 3,000 men between the ages of 39 and 59 for 8 years. It was found that men with type A personality are both twice as likely to get heart disease and twice as likely to die of heart disease. More recent studies have finally looked at the connection between type A and heart disease among women, and they find similar results. Basically, if you're type A, man or woman, you're more likely to get heart disease and more likely to die from having heart disease. One reason why these people might be at greater risk is that they may be more physiologically reactive. That is, they have larger heart rate increases and larger blood pressure increases when they're under stress. And this reactivity could easily lead to cardiovascular problems over time, because these factors can lead to more wear and tear on the heart and blood vessels. The general thinking with type A is that of the 3 components of this personality type, the anger-hostility component is the most important contributor to health outcomes. If you look at all the studies that support the link between type A and heart disease, they all show basically just as strong a link if you look at people who have lots of anger or hostility without the other factors of type A, the competitiveness, ambition, and exaggerated time pressure components. So it appears that hostility is the deadly emotion with regard to type A personality, and particularly so when it involves cynical or suspicious mistrust of others. This slide suggests how hostility and suspicion might result in a dangerous cycle that results in ever-worsening social support. So, you start out with hostility and suspicion. This results in bad social interactions and in turn leads to less social support. Thus, your suspicions and hostility are confirmed, which results in more hostility and suspicion. The first questionnaire from the beginning of this video is a measure of hostility. So look at your score. The scale ranges from 12 to 60, with higher numbers meaning more hostility. Before you start freaking out that you got a higher hostility score than you would have liked and you're now worried about getting heart disease, keep in mind that there are some things that you can do. First, lots of people think that you should vent your emotions. Do things like punch pillows or scream profanities in the privacy of your own home. Freud called this catharsis. However, research suggests that this is the opposite of the truth. It's the expression of the hostility that results in greater cardiovascular activity, not the experience of hostility itself. Let me suggest a couple things you can do next time you feel a bout of hostility coming on that actually will help you decrease your hostility. First, people with type A personality have been helped by interventions that essentially help them remain calm during stressful times. The main things that have been shown to be helpful for people with type A personality are progressive muscle relaxation and anger management statements. Progressive muscle relaxation is a technique designed to reduce physiological arousal. The way it works is for you to focus on specific muscle groups while alternately tightening and relaxing those muscles. After people have mastered a 20-minute version of this, they can learn to use a very quick version where they just take a deep breath, relax everything for a few seconds, and then think pleasant thoughts. Type A people, who are taught to apply this technique to everyday stressful events, show decreased blood pressure, decreased cholesterol, and less feeling of time pressure. Anger management statements are these calming things that Type A people are taught to say to themselves during situations that might arouse anger. The point of these statements is to alter your beliefs, to change the way that you're looking at a situation. For example, people are taught to say things like, "This could be a rough situation, but I know how to deal with it," or "I can work out a plan to handle this," etc. So there is some link between hostility and heart disease, but it's just one of many risk factors, and you can do something about it. You're not destined to die of heart disease if you have Type A personality. Okay, moving on to 3 different personality types that affect general health. First, we're going to talk about optimism. The technical definition in the literature is that optimism is the belief that one will generally experience good outcomes. Optimism is a general way of looking at the future and expecting it to be good. Okay, let's see if you're an optimist or a pessimist. Look at your score from questionnaire number 2. You can see the higher numbers are optimists and the lower numbers are pessimists, and there are some people in between. Lots of research suggests that optimists tend to be healthier than pessimists. A lot of that research shows that optimists are less likely to get ill because they take better care of their health. Here are some examples showing the health differences between optimists and pessimists. First, optimists are more likely to use health-promoting behaviors. For example, optimists are more likely to go into the doctor and get their annual physical exams. They're more likely to eat healthier. They're more likely to get all of their immunizations. And when they get sick and the doctor provides them with a prescription, they're more likely to stick to that prescription. After surgery, optimists are more likely to reduce fats and sodium in their diets than pessimists. And all of these behaviors make you less likely to get sick. Optimists are also less likely to engage in risky behaviors. Optimists are less likely to use illegal drugs, they're less likely to get dangerously drunk, and they're less likely to have unsafe sex. Again, all of these things contribute to the health differences between optimists and pessimists. Furthermore, optimists are less likely to be distressed by physical symptoms. That is, optimists are less likely to pay attention to negative physical symptoms, which means that if optimists are taking a medication that has some unpleasant side effect, they'll be better at sticking to that medicine even though it makes them feel nauseous or tired. Optimists are also more likely to use adaptive coping techniques. When optimists have an illness to cope with, they tend to cope with it in a healthier, more effective way than pessimists. They try to solve the problem instead of ignoring it, which means they're less likely to use drinking as a coping technique. And finally, pessimists also have been shown to have shorter telomeres than optimists. Remember, telomeres are those caps on the ends of chromosomes, and when they get short, the cells die, and signs of aging start to show. So pessimists seem to actually age faster. However, one caveat to this research is that the researchers have only found this link so far for postmenopausal women. Now, all of this might sound sort of counterintuitive. I mean, optimists expect good things to happen in the future, so why are they worrying about getting sick and making efforts to prevent themselves from getting sick? Well, some people argue that because optimists feel good about the future, they go to greater lengths to make sure they'll be around and healthy for the future. They spend less time worrying about the future and simply behave in ways to make a healthier future happen. Other research finds other ways that optimism leads to better health. One very interesting study looked at law students as they went through their first year of law school. At 5 times during the school year, researchers measured their optimism and immune functioning. Why measure optimism repeatedly if it's supposedly a personality trait? As you may know, personality traits are supposed to be stable and unchanging across your life, sort of genetically hardwired. But optimism, for one, is thought to be less stable than other personality traits. Only about 25% of a person's optimism is thought to be determined by their genes, whereas other personality traits are usually range from about 40% to 60% heritable. So there should be some room to move optimism around. So in this study, they measured students' optimism and immune system function 5 times over the first year of law school. And they didn't just measure their global overall optimism, their overall beliefs that the future would be generally good. They also measured the law school students' specific optimism about law school, their expectations for how law school would go. So some of the items measuring this were, I will be less successful than most of my classmates, and it's unlikely that I'll fail. These researchers found that the thing that mattered in terms of predicting immunity wasn't global overall optimism, but instead was law school specific optimism. And they found that what matters was not your level of law school specific optimism, but the change in law school specific optimism. So it didn't much matter where your law school optimism started, but if it increased over the year, then your immune system functioning would be better off. And if your law school specific optimism decreased over the year, then your immune system functioning would also get worse. Another study collected a sample of women who were HIV positive and who were taking complicated medications for their disease. These women were all on protease inhibitor cocktails where they had to take 3 or more awful drugs each day. The women were taking an average of 24 pills per day apiece, and those pills had horrible side effects. But if you don't take your medication correctly, you can accidentally grow a strain of the virus that no drugs can help. So helping HIV patients stay on these medications is very important. The women in this study wrote in journals. The pessimistic women in the group wrote about the most positive future they could imagine. They wrote about this twice a week, 10 minutes at a time, for a month. At the end of the month, they came back to the lab, and the researchers measured their level of optimism and how well they were taking care of their health. The researcher found that this writing intervention made the participants much more optimistic compared to other pessimistic subjects who didn't write in journals. And not only did it make them more optimistic, but it also led to them taking better care of their health. That is, it made them stick to their medications they were taking. Not only did they adhere to their medications better, but they also felt fewer side effects from them. Thus, it's possible to make pessimistic people feel more optimistic and to give them the health benefits that are associated with optimism. Moving on to a third personality trait that relates to health, neuroticism. Neuroticism is a tendency to worry excessively over minor events and setbacks. People high in neuroticism tend to overpredict what's going to be scary in their lives and underpredict their ability to cope with these things. Questionnaire 3 measured neuroticism. This scale ranges from 3 to 15, with higher scores being more neurotic. In one study that investigated the link between personality and health, the researchers collected over 1,600 men. These men were surveyed 6 times during the study. The researchers also measured the health of the men in several ways, including the men's own self-reports of their health, some doctor-measured items taken from medical charts, And finally, they measured when the participants died, if they did die within the study time frame. Then they looked to see whether their levels of neuroticism predicted when they would die. But they looked at this in a sort of interesting way. They divided the men up into those who were higher than average in neuroticism and those who were lower than average in neuroticism, which is pretty standard in these kinds of personality and health studies. But since they had 6 measures of neuroticism for each man over the 12 years, they were also able to look at whether the men got more neurotic over the years or less neurotic over the years. So what did they find? Well, this graph shows the men's probability of survival based on whether they were high or low in neuroticism and whether their neuroticism increased or decreased over the course of the study. And they were able to measure this all the way up to 6 years after the study ended. So they had death information even after they stopped measuring personality, probably from death certificates. So the x-axis is showing you the number of years since the study began, and the y-axis is showing you the probability of survival. And what you can see from the graph is that 3 of the groups, of these lines, are basically the same as each other, A, B, and C. But one group has a much lower probability of surviving all 18 years. That group of men was the group with higher than average neuroticism that also increased in neuroticism over the years. So that's bad news for highly neurotic men who have increases in neuroticism. But notice also that it's quite good news for neurotic men who showed less neuroticism over the years. Note that those men are just as likely to survive as the men who are low in neuroticism. So how does neuroticism link to health? Well, one explanation we can rule out is that they're more likely to be depressed. Neurotic men are more likely to be depressed, but in this study, the researchers controlled for level of depression. Another explanation is that neurotic people may engage in less healthy behaviors like smoking or drinking. So neurotic people may be shortening their lives by engaging in poor health activities. Another explanation has to do with stress management. Neuroticism has been shown to be linked to poor management of stress, so neuroticism might lead to poor health through all the stress pathways that we've talked about in previous videos. And now for our final personality trait that's linked to health, conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is another personality trait that has some level of relationship. And now to our final personality trait that's linked to health, conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is another personality trait that has some relationship to health. Conscientiousness is the tendency to be careful, deliberate, self-disciplined, thorough, and organized. Conscientiousness was measured using questionnaire number 4. This scale goes from 4 to 20, with higher scores being more conscientious. The relationship between conscientiousness and health was shown most clearly in a longitudinal study called the Terman study. The study started in 1921. 1,500 children were selected to participate in the study because they were considered gifted. That is, they had to have an IQ of at least 135 to participate in the study. These kids were then studied for their entire lives. All but a handful of them have died by now, but there's just tons of data on every aspect of these people's lives. One of the most striking findings from this study is that conscientiousness predicted a longer life, and this is conscientiousness measured when these people were kids. The researchers said that conscientiousness was the best childhood personality predictor of longevity. And that's what this graph is showing you. The dashed lines are men and women high in conscientiousness. As you can see, these are the people who had the lower probability of dying with increased age. For both men and women, those with higher conscientiousness had a lower probability of dying. The researchers described the conscientious kids as prudent, persistent, well-organized, somewhat obsessive, and not at all carefree. These people were less likely to smoke, drink, or drive dangerously, which certainly explains some of the lifespan effects. But the researchers say that this doesn't explain the whole story, because conscientious subjects were also less likely to die from illnesses that aren't related to dangerous or unhealthy behaviors. So the effect of conscientiousness on health is only partly due to behavior. But now, onto an area where personality just doesn't matter at all. What disease doesn't have a personality component? You might have already guessed that it's cancer. There's a common stereotype of a cancer-prone personality, sometimes called type C personality. This stereotype is a person who's easygoing and agreeable, but who represses emotions that are hard to deal with or that might get in the way of smooth and easy social relationships. They're thought to have trouble expressing tension, anger, and anxiety, and instead present themselves as pleasant, calm, compliant, and passive. If you look at the studies of the cancer-prone personality, there really isn't much evidence for this pattern. Every study of the cancer-prone personality finds different traits associated with greater risk of getting cancer. Thus, the list of traits that have at some point been linked to cancer is super long. It includes many traits as well as their opposites, such as nervous and lack of anxiety, able to have relationships and unable to have relationships, ego-centered and puts others' needs before one's own, negative views of the self and positive views of the self, and so forth. Because so many traits are on this list, virtually anyone can be convinced that they have these traits and thus are cancer-prone. Most of the studies of the cancer-prone personality are fatally flawed. A remarkable amount of truly bad science has been thrown at this research question over the years. The typical experiment on type C personality collects a whole bunch of people with cancer, gives them a whole bunch of personality tests, and then looks for traits that lots of these patients share. And they tended to all find pretty different things. The trouble with this approach is that maybe those different traits that they find are a result of having cancer, rather than something that caused the person to get cancer. To research the cancer-prone personality correctly, you need to measure people's personality at the beginning of the study, then wait for 10 or 20 years and see which people get cancer and which people don't. And then you can compare the personalities of the people who got cancer to the people who didn't get cancer. You need this long time span because cancer takes a long time to grow, and you want to be sure that you're measuring people's personality before the cancer starts growing. There are 3 batches of studies that were done in this way. The first batch found that people who repressed emotions were more likely to get cancer 10 years later. This was consistent with the stereotype of the cancer-prone personality, and this what is often gets cited to support the stereotype. However, the second batch found that people who repressed their emotions were less likely to get cancer 10 years later, and the third batch found no traits that predicted cancer. So the actual data are inconclusive, even though people still seem to think that there's a link between repression of emotions and cancer. It just isn't supported by evidence. And we can't in good faith make this claim at this time.